October 9th, 1977. London. The kind of afternoon that arrives in autumn like an apology, gray sky pressed low over the rooftops. A fine mist in the air that was not quite rain but wet enough to soak through a jacket in 20 minutes if you stood still long enough. Notting Hill smelled of damp stone and frying onions from a cafe 2 doors down, and the leaves that had fallen from the plane trees along the pavement were already turning dark and sticking flat to the cobblestones like pressed flowers in an old book. On a corner of Portobello Road, where the market stalls had packed up 2 hours earlier and the street was mostly empty, a young man was playing guitar. Before we go any further, if stories like this are the kind that stop you mid-scroll and leave something behind, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because we put one of these out every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. His name was Clifton Reed. He was 20 years old, and he had been in London for 11 months, arriving from Kingston the previous November on a one-way ticket bought with money borrowed from 3 different relatives, and repaid in a promise to make something of himself that he was still, 11 months later, in the process of figuring out. He had found a room in a house in Ladbroke Grove shared with 6 other Jamaican men, all of them in various stages of the same long negotiation between what they had imagined England would be and what England actually was. He worked mornings at a bakery on Golborne Road, 4 until 8, and spent the rest of the day either sleeping or playing on the street corners of Notting Hill, which was the neighborhood that felt most like home because it sounded most like home. The patois drifting from open windows, the smell of curry goat on a Saturday, the sound of Studio One records leaking from somebody's flat above a betting shop. He played a battered second-hand guitar, a 1960s K acoustic he had found in a junk shop on Westbourne Grove for £4.50. He had sanded down a rough spot on the neck himself with a piece of emery board. He played it strapped over his shoulder with a strip of leather cut from an old belt, and he played standing up always, because his father had told him that a man who plays sitting down is playing for himself, but a man who plays standing up is playing for the world. He had a voice that fit the street the way good street music always does, not too loud, not too soft, carrying just far enough to reach the person passing 10 feet away and make them slow down without quite knowing why. He played original songs mostly, built on a reggae foundation but reaching toward something else, something that had absorbed 11 months of London radio and the records he borrowed from his housemates, and the jazz he heard leaking from the pub on the corner on Thursday nights. His lyrics were specific and imagistic, the kind that came from a person who had learned English partly as a school subject and partly as a second skin, which gave the words a particular quality, chosen more deliberately than someone who had grown up inside the language, each one sitting in its place with a slight extra weight. That afternoon he had been playing for 3 hours. His guitar case was open on the pavement in front of him, a few coins inside, a folded £5 note he had put there himself at the start to encourage the psychology of generosity in passers-by. The mist had dampened the strings slightly, affecting the sustain, and he had retuned twice. A woman pushing a pram had stopped for a full song and a half and left 2 coins. 3 teenagers had watched from across the street for a few minutes before moving on. An old Jamaican man with a shopping bag had stopped, listened, and said, simply and without elaboration, "Nice, son," which Clifton had held onto for the rest of the afternoon, the way you hold onto small warmths when the air is cold. Across the street, standing in the shallow doorway of a closed ironmonger's shop with his collar turned up against the mist, a man had been leaning against the doorframe for the better part of 20 minutes, listening. He wore a heavy olive-green army jacket, the dreadlocks beneath his knitted tam invisible under the collar, and he held a brown paper bag from the market, peppers, ginger root, 2 tins of something, that he had bought 20 minutes earlier and had not yet taken home because the music from across the street had stopped him. He was not a large man, and he stood without the posture of a man who expected to be recognized, which was one of the reasons nobody on the wet street had recognized him. He simply looked like another Jamaican man in Notting Hill on a gray October afternoon, standing in a doorway waiting for the rain to decide what it wanted to do. His name was Robert Nesta Marley, and he was 32 years old, and in 2 days he had a meeting at Island Records about the album that would become Kaya, and in 11 days he had a concert in Paris. And right now none of that existed because a young man across a wet London street was playing a rhythm that had come from the same island, the same air, the same particular quality of light and loss that Bob had carried inside him since he was old enough to feel it. A car moved slowly down the street, someone looking for a parking space. A pigeon landed on the edge of a market stall frame, looked around, and left. The mist continued its patient work on everything it touched. Then a black car pulled up at the curb. The man who stepped out was tall, with shoulder-length brown hair and the particular physical ease of someone who has been looked at for so long that being looked at has become the natural condition of existence. He wore a long dark coat, a scarf wound loosely at the neck, and boots with a slight heel that clicked against the pavement with a sound that had in it the faint sound of a person who has learned to occupy space fully. He said something to the driver, who nodded, and the car moved on. Mick Jagger stood on the pavement and looked up at the street with the expression of a man orienting himself, then began to walk. He was passing through. He had an appointment in the area, a photographer's studio 3 blocks up, and had asked the driver to drop him short because he liked to walk the last part of streets he knew well. Notting Hill in 1977 was a neighborhood the Stones had connections to, people they knew, a studio they had used more than once. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets and his head slightly down against the mist. He heard Clifton before he saw him. He slowed as most people slowed without quite deciding to. He turned toward the music. He stood on the pavement opposite and listened for a moment, 20 seconds, perhaps 30. He tilted his head slightly, the way a person does when they are assessing rather than simply receiving. Then the corner of his mouth moved. It was not a cruel smile exactly. It was the smile of a man who has spent 15 years at the top of a particular mountain and has developed in that time the habit of looking at things from above. He turned to the woman beside him, a friend, a photographer's assistant, someone who had been walking with him from the car, and said, loud enough to carry easily across the narrow street in the way that voices carry on wet pavement, "Reggae. Every Jamaican with a guitar thinks he's going to be the next big thing." He paused. "It's not real rock, is it? It never quite gets there." The woman smiled the way people smile when they are with someone famous, and are not entirely sure whether to agree or whether agreeing is the thing that will be held against them later. Clifton had heard it. His fingers did not stop moving on the strings. He had learned, on 11 months of street corners, that stopping was the thing that confirmed you had been hurt, and he had decided some time ago not to give that confirmation to anyone. But his eyes went to the pavement in front of his guitar case, and the song he was playing lost something in the middle of a bar, some interior light going briefly out before his hands found it again. In the doorway across the street, Bob Marley had also heard it. He was still for a moment. The paper bag shifted slightly in his hand as his grip adjusted, not from tension exactly, but from the particular physical response the body makes when the mind has just made a decision it hasn't yet announced to anyone. He looked at Clifton, at the boy's eyes going down, at the almost invisible hitch in the music. And then he looked at Mick Jagger on the pavement, who had already half-turned to continue walking, as though the comment had been made and filed, and the moment was already behind him. Bob stepped out of the doorway and crossed the street. He walked at the same unhurried pace he always walked, the paper bag in one hand, the mist settling on the shoulders of his jacket. He crossed behind Jagger without the man seeing him and walked to Clifton's corner. Clifton looked up. He saw a man in a green jacket and a tam, a brown paper bag from the market, a calm face that he did not immediately recognize. "That was good," Bob said simply. "The change in the bridge of that last song, where did that come from?" Clifton blinked. He hadn't expected a comment and certainly not a specific one. I don't know, he said. It just felt like where the song wanted to go. Bob nodded slowly, as though this was the right answer to the question, which it was. Can I play something? He said. I won't be long. Clifton looked at the guitar, then at the man. Something in the way he had asked, not reaching for the instrument, just waiting with the question open in the air, made Clifton simply unsling the strap from his shoulder and hold the guitar out. Bob took it with both hands. He felt the weight of it, turned it once, pressed the face of the body lightly with his palm as though listening through his hand. He slung the strap over his own shoulder, placed his fingers on the neck, and looked across the street. Mick Jagger had stopped walking. He had heard, or perhaps simply felt, the way you feel when the quality of the air behind you changes, that something was different. He turned. He saw the man across the street picking up a street musician's guitar. He saw the man's profile under the tam. He went still. Bob began to play. He played Clifton's song first. The same chords, the same structure, but with the reggae skank underneath given its full weight and patience. The 2 and the 4, that sideways rocking motion that sits in the body before it reaches the brain. The sound that had come from mento and ska and rock steady and arrived here in 1977 as its fullest self. And what he showed, in 30 seconds of playing someone else's song, was that it was not a lesser thing than rock, not an incomplete thing, not something that almost got there. It was something that had gotten to a completely different place, a place with its own coordinates and its own gravity, and it had done so entirely on its own terms. Then he opened his mouth and sang. Do you remember the first time you heard a sound that you felt in your chest before you understood it with your mind? Write it in the comments below. We read every single one. It was not a full song. It was something that began as Clifton's melody and became its own, a rising line, unhurried, the voice carrying the specific weight of a man who had grown up in Trenchtown and survived things that most people on this wet London street would never be asked to survive, and had turned all of it into something that was not complaint and not performance but simply truth, offered plainly, the way you offer something to a person and wait for them to receive it or not. The mist continued to fall. Somewhere up the street, a bus changed gears. A woman came out of a bakery with a paper bag of bread and stopped in the doorway when she heard the music. 2 men who had been arguing quietly near a parked car went quiet. Mick Jagger stood on the opposite pavement with his hands in his coat pockets and his head tilted, and on his face was an expression that had very little to do with the one he had worn 30 seconds earlier. It was not chastened exactly, and it was not theatrical. It was the expression of a man who is genuinely hearing something, which is a different thing from the expression of a man who is listening, and the difference was visible. Bob played for perhaps 2 minutes, no longer. He did not play to make a point, or if he did, the point was not about Mick Jagger. The point was about Clifton's song, about what was already in it, about what a street corner in Notting Hill on a gray October afternoon deserved to hear. When the last note faded, he let it go fully, waiting until the vibration had left the wood before lifting his hand. He looked at Clifton. He handed back the guitar with both hands, the way you return something that belongs to someone. Your bridge, he said quietly. Don't change it, that's the best part. Clifton took the guitar and held it against his chest. He had recognized the man somewhere in the middle of the second verse, the voice being the thing that made the recognition inevitable, and had spent the rest of the song in a state that was not quite disbelief and not quite belief, but somewhere in the narrow space between them where extraordinary things sometimes live. He started. Keep playing, Bob said, and touched the boy's shoulder once lightly and turned. Mick Jagger had crossed the street. He was standing a few feet away, hands still in his coat pockets, the scarf loose at his neck, and he looked stripped, briefly, of the particular armor that being Mick Jagger provided. Which was not a small thing to be stripped of, like a man who has just been taught something in public and is deciding what to do with the lesson. He looked at Bob. Bob looked at him. Bob, Jagger said. Just the name. An acknowledgement that he had known for some seconds now and had not announced, which was its own kind of courtesy. Mick, Bob said. A moment passed between them on the wet pavement. Around them the street continued, a cyclist, a dog, the distant sound of a market radio from somewhere behind the closed stalls. Do you think a single moment like this one can actually change the way someone hears music forever? Tell us what you think. We love hearing from you. It gets there, Bob said finally. Simple, without edge. Not a rebuke and not a lecture. Just a correction, the kind offered between people who both understand what they're talking about. It gets where it's going. It just doesn't go where you're going. He paused. That's not the same thing as not getting there. Jagger looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. One nod small, the kind that means more than a speech. Fair enough, he said. Bob picked up his paper bag from where he had set it on the pavement beside the guitar case. He looked at Clifton one more time. Clifton was watching him with the expression of a person who will be telling this story for the rest of their life, which is exactly what happened. Bob reached into the pocket of his jacket and took out a guitar pick. Old, the edges worn round, a small circular logo on its surface that Clifton would not identify until much later. He set it on top of the coins in the guitar case without ceremony. Then he turned up his collar against the mist and walked back toward Ladbroke Grove. Mick Jagger stood on the pavement for a moment after he left, looking at the space where he had been. Then he turned to Clifton, who was still holding the guitar against his chest like something he was not entirely sure was real. Sorry, Jagger said, plainly, without performance. The word of a man who had decided in the last 2 minutes that a thing he had said needed to be unsaid and had no better way to do it. He reached into his coat and left something in the guitar case. Clifton never said how much, only that it covered 3 months of his share of the rent in the house on Ladbroke Grove, and walked on up the street toward the photographer's studio. Clifton Reed stood on the corner of Portobello Road in the October mist and looked at the worn guitar pick in his guitar case. He picked it up and held it in his palm. He stood there for a long time after both men had gone, the guitar hanging from the strap, his hand closed around the pick. Then he took a breath and began to play again. He played the same song he had been playing when Mick Jagger had stopped and laughed. He played it the same way he always played it. But the bridge, the part that Bob Marley had told him was the best part, he held a little longer than he had before, giving it the space it deserved, the same space a man in a green jacket had just shown him it was capable of filling. He kept the pick for the rest of his life. He played professionally for 12 years, touring through the Caribbean and parts of Europe, recording 2 albums that were loved by people who knew them and largely ignored by people who didn't, which is the ordinary fate of most music and no judgment on the music itself. He never became famous in the way the world uses the word. He became known in the way that matters more, which is slowly and genuinely, one person at a time. On this channel, we tell the stories that carry what Bob Marley's music carries, the belief that every sound made honestly deserves its full space in the world. If this story reached you today, please subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. And in Bob Marley's own words, one good thing about music, when it hits you, you feel no pain.